Okay, let's get started. We're sewing up at the V-rise option of the Brizo Bikini Bottoms. And I accidentally grabbed the crotch liner. Whoops! I have the high leg line here. So we're going to start by sewing our front pieces together. Make sure you pin it at the 3/8 seam allowance on the edges so you get a nice smooth line from piece 1 to piece 2. Here you can sew this first seam on your sewing machine. If you really want to use your serger, I'm going to show you a little trick. Since there is kind of no stop on piece 1, the bigger piece on the bottom, what you have to do if you want to use your serger is clip into your seam allowance just a little bit on the bigger piece 1. That way we can fold back this part that we're not sewing and stitch right onto our seam allowance. Otherwise, you can just use your sewing machine and you don't have to worry about making that little clip in. It's a 3/8 seam allowance, so I'm going to let my serger trim off 1/8 of an inch. You can see I started by hand cranking my wheel. That's to make sure my fabric doesn't slip and slide at the beginning and my pieces stay aligned exactly where I want them to. There we go. Just going to trim this little tail here. Now we're just going to continue just like this is one front piece on a normal swimsuit. You can top stitch this seam here if you want to. I recommend pressing it downward and top stitching it down if you are going to top stitch. So this is my back piece. Again, I have that high leg line that's super cheeky. And then the crotch lining, I'm just partially lining here. So if you're fully lining, you'll be doing it a little bit different. This is the partial liner. I usually go for partial lining unless my fabric is just very, very thin or a very light color that I'm worried is going to be see-through. I usually do not do the full lining. Make sure you pin at the 3/8 seam allowance here on the edges. And then you're just going to ease these opposite curves together. You shouldn't need to stretch any pieces to fit here, but since they're opposite curves, you will have to ease them in together. Take your time here. This can be a little bit tricky, especially if this is your first underwear or swimsuit. This little crotch piece can be a little bit finicky sometimes. I like to do my pins vertically like this. I can have a few more in there, keeping it nice and straight. I do like the ones on the end going the other direction, and that's because I like to leave them in as long as I possibly can. So you can see that start one is horizontal, and I will do my other ones kind of vertically. Just like I did my first stitch, I will leave this pin in until I know my serger needle has gone through all 3 layers and nothing's going to slip and slide. I highly recommend using pins when sewing swim fabric versus clips because of this. You know, you can leave it in there and hand crank or take off very slowly and leave that needle in there, making sure none of your layers are slipping and sliding. If you're having a difficult time with everything slipping and sliding, you can also baste this on the machine first and then move to your serger. Basting will be your best friend if you happen to have a swim fabric that is super slippery. Okay. All right, now we're just going to take it slow, again letting the machine cut off 1/8 of an inch for our 3/8 seam allowance. Swim fabric, you can have swim fabric that works and plays really nicely with you, and some swim fabric, even if it is the exact same kind of content, just a slippery mess. So if you have a swim fabric that is just a slippery mess and wants to slip and slide everywhere, pin and baste, pin and baste, pin and baste. That way you won't be seam ripping a ton, you'll just be basting a ton. And if it slips a little bit while you're basting, then it's easy to take out and redo, unlike a final stitch, which is not fun to remove. It's also easier to just keep everything steady on a sewing machine versus a serger, so basting is always a good idea. Just flipped my crotch liner right sides up. It should align to this front piece nice and perfectly. I'm pinning along the edges. I never finish my top edge of my crotch lining piece, the one that's to the right here. You can run it through the serger or do an overcast stitch to finish the edge. Personally, I never do. The swim fabric doesn't roll, and I just prefer the feeling of a not finished edge. But if you prefer it finished, you can finish that edge right there. Just basting right here. I use a very small 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to baste here. Just is nice and much easier than leaving the pins in. I highly recommend basting it together versus using pins. Again, swim fabric can be slippery, and so this is going to help it not slip and slide. A baste is nice and quick and easy too. If you are just learning to dive into swim, I highly recommend making best friends with basting. Anytime I skip basting, even years after sewing swim, I always regret it. So take your time and baste, 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 baste. Okay, now we have a beautiful little crotch seam. We're going to sew up the side seams now. So we're going to lay it out right sides together and align our side seams. They're super tiny on this V-rise high leg line. Excuse my camera maneuvering. I don't know if I'll ever get really good at videoing sewing for y'all. I try my best, but you know, it is still super awkward with that camera right in front of my face, in between me and what I'm working on. Sometimes I bump it and move it. All right, here we go. We're just gonna stitch these up real quick, and then we're gonna move on to attaching the elastic. I am not gonna go into detail on attaching the elastic. I have other videos on attaching elastic to swimwear that goes into great detail. So if you need help attaching elastic, I highly recommend going back to the tutorial for these Brizo bottoms and clicking that how to attach swimwear elastic. I have several links at the very beginning before the tutorial even starts. I'm all about sewing swim for beginners, and one of them is attaching elastic. So if you're struggling attaching elastic to swimwear, highly recommend going and giving that a watch. And it will explain it in full detail, give you some tips and tricks and whatnot. You can see how slippery my fabric is, and once again, I always leave that pin in there until I know my needle has hit the thread just 1 or 2 times, and then I remove that pin. All right, they look like swim bottoms now. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about attaching elastic. Instead, I'm going to do a little bit of video magic. Boop. And now I have attached all my elastic, and I'm going to fold it under and top stitch now. I'm going to use my cover stitch. You can also use whatever high stretch stitch you have on your machine that you like the look of. I often use a triple step zigzag, and then we're done. Don't forget to share your Brizo bikini bottoms with us once you finish them up. I can't wait to see yours. Bye, y'all.